Oh, hi there. This is a video about who owns your central bank. Sorry.
I'm sorry.
No, it's my fault. Sorry. Now, I don't know where you're watching this from. I'm actually in England, in the UK, so I've got a Bank of England. Lucky me. But this video isn't just about the Bank of England. It's about central banks more generally and who owns them. Because if you look online, you get quite a confusing picture of who owns central banks. Some central banks say they're publicly owned, like the Bank of England, Bank of Nigeria, Bank of Saudi Arabia, Bank of Mongolia, lots of them. Sorry. Other central banks say they're privately owned, like the Bank of Italy. Other central banks, like the Fed, say no one owns them. So we'll talk about that. Now, if you haven't been to my channel before, I like taking you and showing you lots of interesting places around the UK and the world, but really mostly the UK right now. Now, I've brought you to a very interesting place. I don't know if you know where I am. I'll give you a clue. That building is called Dragon Hall. So I'll tell you where I am at the end of the video. But for now, let's go somewhere else and talk about who owns your central bank, or my central bank. Sorry, let's go. Now, by the way, if you haven't been to my channel before, then hello, welcome. I'm Sue. I think I've already said that. Better just pick up my phone though, eh? And most of my videos take the form of kind of walking tours and take you on a tour really of central bank ownership and show you 3 places in London which relate to 3 different types of owning central bank, 3 ownership models. Firstly, private ownership. Secondly, public ownership. And thirdly, something else, which I think I'll just call a fusion. So let's go into the City of London, and we're going to see loads of dragons, because dragons are kind of the mascot really of the City of London, which is the financial district of London run by the City of London Corporation. Now, the first place I want to take you to in the City of London is not the Bank of England, which is there. I've got another video where I take you there. If you'd like to watch that, then click here if I finish editing it. But yeah, it should be there. But let's not go to the Bank of England now. Let's actually go back in time to when the Bank of England was founded in 1694, when it was a private company. And for quite some time, it actually was based in a place called Grocers Hall. So let's go to the present day Grocers Hall, which is just there next to the Bank of England. So there it is, Grocers Hall. Now, you might be wondering, why was the Bank of England a private company at this time in 1694, founded with some grocers? So I don't know what you think grocers are. In the UK, we normally say greengrocers, people that trade in green groceries, like these kind of things, and things that aren't green, but fruits and vegetables usually thought of. Now, these grocers weren't really grocers of fruits and vegetables. If you look at their logo there and the camels all around the place, you might be able to guess where they were trading initially. And it was really actually with the Byzantine Empire, trading spices. Now, I don't know if you've tried British food. It's not run out of being all that spicy, and we really needed things like pepper. Now, pepper was so valuable that it was a form of currency in itself, and people used to pay their rents in peppercorns. So in the UK, we still have this term, which is peppercorn rent, which actually means very low or zero rents. But as you probably are aware, rents aren't low or zero in the UK right now, and you can't currently pay in pepper. So let's move forward to 1694, which is when the Bank of England was founded. Now, by this time period, the grocers had really branched out and were now trading things like gold. So you can probably see why it made sense for the Bank of England to be founded in Grocers Hall, because the Bank of England was a private institution which enabled rich merchants like grocers to lend money to the government. And the Bank of England, therefore, was really founded as the banker to the government. Now, there are a few reasons why the Bank of England was so important. Firstly, it's not just when England got our Bank of England, it's also when we got our national debt, because the Bank of England was a way for bankers in England to lend money to the government. It started off as a private institution to basically be the banker to the government, and it was charging interest on the loans to the government. So our national debt literally started in 1694 when we got the Bank of England. Now, that has massive implications. It might be interesting to you even if you're not in England, because you've probably also got your own national debt now and your own central bank. A lot of these ideas started in the 17th century, really. And we could talk more about that, but for now, let's not. Let's talk about the ownership of this Bank of England. Sorry about the sound effects here. There is a cat here. Any thoughts on the Bank of England? So it was private, and it really was a private banker to the government. And that sounds maybe not like a big deal, but it was a really big deal, because say you were a private banker or a grocer, say, Back in 1694, you might not have really wanted to lend money to the government because the government was really driven by the needs of the king or the queen. If you lent them money and they didn't want to pay it back, they could just chop your head off. That's a kind of catchphrase really of the monarchy, off with their head. So you might not have wanted to do that. So this basically gave bankers and merchants and grocers a safer way to lend money to the government, the king or the queen. So anyway, let's move away from Grocers' Hall now and sort of summarise this little bit really, which is that when the Bank of England was founded, it was a private institution. And also, not only the Bank of England, our national debt was founded. And the idea really that governments borrow at interest from private markets really. But what does it mean when we say that a central bank is private? What are the central banks that are still private? What does that mean? Well, let me just point something out really, which is there next to the Bank of England, or used to be, was the stock exchange. So when a company is private, it generally means that it's owned by the people that have stocks or shares in that company. Now, with the Bank of England, things are a little bit grey because two of the people that had stocks or shares in the company were the King and Queen, who gave it a royal charter, helped found it. So I'd say that means it's private, but it's partly owned by the monarchy, which is pretty public, you could say. In fact, though, let's go and have a look at the old Stock Exchange building. Not a Stock Exchange anymore, but that's one of the old Royal Exchange buildings, actually. Now, companies that were listed on the old Stock Exchange, the old Royal Exchange, many of them had these things called royal charters. Now, the Bank of England had a royal charter, but let me give you a different example, which is the South Sea Company, which had a royal charter. Now, the logo of the South Sea Company is here. Nice logo there. It's got some little fish on with crowns. Actually, it's nice, isn't it? Because officially it was about encouraging fishing and fisheries. And I won't go into all the details, but I will just say it had a monopoly on supplying slaves to the South Seas, to the Americas. It was also actually really set up as a competitor to the Bank of England. The idea was that this company, this private company, would help service the UK national debt. But it didn't manage that. It went completely bust, actually. And in fact, the government ended up taking on more debt. And we've been paying off that debt from the South Sea bubble. And we actually finished paying off the debt from this South Sea Company in 2015, actually. Now that's quite a lot there, I've just said, probably too much for this short video. But the gist that I'm really trying to get across to you is that at this time period, we had private companies that had royal charters, which meant they had elements of them that were kind of public in some sense. And they could do things that the royalty could do and that states could do, like raise taxes and have private armies. Now, the Bank of England didn't have its own private army. However, it did help fund the army of the government. And that's what a lot of the early funding was really for. Wars. Can't really stress that enough. There were loads of wars, actually, that Britain was in all around the world, really. But then, after all these wars all around the world, then we had World War I and World War II. And the government thought, enough war. And the Bank of England was nationalised. So I'd like to take you somewhere else in the City of London to think about this next period when the Bank of England was officially public, really. So let's go somewhere public in the City of London. Quite hard to find somewhere that's public, but let's go to the hospital, St Bartholomew's Hospital, which I think is still just about public. So let's go there. So in 1946, the Bank of England was nationalised by the Prime Minister at the time, Clement Attlee. So when it was nationalised, it meant that the Bank of England was now wholly owned by the government, not by its individual shareholders, who actually initially were partly the government, really, the King or the Queen. But anyway, officially now it's a public institution. It's publicly owned. Or is it? Well, that's a question, really. If you ask the Bank of England or look at their website, they say they're wholly owned by the government. However, I would argue that it's not quite as clear-cut as that because of these national debts talked about earlier. So, although the Bank of England is now owned by the government itself owes money to private markets. And the private debts were carried over, really, in this time period. So some examples of debts that were carried over, I've already mentioned one, the debt of the South Sea Company. We're still paying that back till 2015. Another example is the debt that was taken on during the abolition of the slave trade. Now, you might have thought the Bank of England might borrow money to give compensation to people that were enslaved. No, the Bank of England, well, the government borrowed money to compensate slave owners, which had quite big impacts on the power dynamics that were taken forward when slavery ended. And that's another loan that was only really properly paid off in 2015. There were also, of course, massive debts taken on at the end of World War One. They were also paid, most of them I think, in 2015 as well. So that's something to think about really. But let's move away from the hospital. It's creepy to hang around the hospital anyway. And let's go now though to talk about how the Bank of England runs today. Is it public or is it private officially today? So the last place I want to take you to in the City of London is a place called Mansion House. Mansion, I think, means house. So it's house. Anyway, but Mansion House is the place which you might have heard of. It's where the Chancellor of the Exchequer will generally go and visit the City of London. Now in 1997, our Chancellor was someone called Gordon Brown, and he went to the City of London and he decided to make the Bank of England independent from the government which owned it. So that meant the Bank of England could make decisions like set interest rates independently of the government which owned it. But anyway, how does it work in practice? Well, let's look at how the government and the Bank of England, which is independent from the government which owns it, how they communicate, for example. So the government will set targets the Bank of England has to meet. And if they don't meet their targets, they write letters to each other. So the key target really is about inflation, and they've been off target for some time really. So they've been writing a lot of letters, which you can read if you want to. So where are we up to now? I've been asking who owns central banks, and I've given the example of the Bank of England, which started off as privately owned in 1694, owned by its shareholders or stockholders as the private banker to the government. Its role grew and it became not just a banker to the government, but to all other private banks. Didn't say that, was quite important probably. And then in 1946, it was nationalised. So officially now it became owned by the government. Then in 1997, it was made independent of the government which owned it. So the theory is the Bank of England is owned by the government, which is quite similar to other central banks actually, most of them. Now there are some exceptions, of course. However, it's my opinion that actually pretty much all central banks are owned by the same, not exactly person. And do you want to know my opinion of who that is? A cat. No, that's a joke actually. Hello. Now I'm not entirely joking, to be honest, just it's very hard to say if you can own a cat, or even if you do own a cat, if you have any sense of control over it. I think it's genuinely quite hard to say who owns or who controls, anyway, central banks. I think it's quite a lot more complex than many people make it out to be, really. But I can answer a different question you probably didn't ask, which is where did I start filming and why did I start filming at Dragon Hall? Dragons were supposed to be a sub-theme of this video, kind of forgot to mention them much. But there are, as I say, dragons all around the financial centre of London and all around the Bank of England when you come out the tube as well. And dragons to some extent are, as I said, the mascot of the City of London Corporation. Now some people think they control everything. I don't really believe that actually, and Dragon Hall is actually not in the City of London. It's another city that's also full of dragons. So look at those dragons there. They seem to have boobs. But anyway, that's the building that used to be a company called Norwich Union. And the city, you may have guessed, is Norwich. So Norwich Union was a life insurance company, a mutual. So it was co-owned by its policyholders, really. However, it's recently been taken over by a multinational company, Aviva, who are, among other things, a pension fund. So why am I telling you this about Norwich Union? Well, I'm telling you this because earlier in the video, I said that when the Bank of England was set up, it was a way for private bankers to lend money to the government. Now, while we still have this idea that governments borrow from private markets, who these markets are has changed quite a lot. And actually, quite a lot of the markets, you could say, that own government debt are things like pension funds, like, for example, Aviva. So you could even possibly say that if you have a pension, do you? I don't actually, my mum does. But anyway, if you do have a pension, because your pension fund owns some government debt probably, and because in theory governments own central banks, then you might own a bit of the Bank of England. Although actually the Bank of England owns some UK government debt. So perhaps the Bank of England really owns itself, which is what the Fed says about itself. Anyway, there are some different ways to look at things. But for now, enough looking at that. Let's look at something else. Let's look at Norwich again. It's a really fabulous city, by the way. Do go visit if you get a chance. Dragon Hall, by the way, is a centre for writing. And Norwich is the city where the first book written in English by a woman was thought to have been written by someone called Julian of Norwich, from Norwich. And that was written in the 14th century. So those dragons don't represent financial markets, and perhaps we could sort of rewrite some of the ideas and rules about how markets work. That's another idea. Norwich is certainly a place with lots of ideas. I went past a coffee shop and asked the person outside if they owned the coffee shop, and he said, "Can you own a coffee shop?" Turns out he sort of does actually. He's co-owner. It's a great coffee shop, Aroma Coffee. Do go there if you're in Norwich. You're probably not in Norwich, are you?
Philosophers here.
We're all, yes, are you a philosopher? I just pop it in. It might go on YouTube, but it might not.
Okay.
Oh, now I'm doing a dick, aren't I?
No, you're not at all.
I think it's time to end now, and I will leave you in Norwich. Let's leave you in Norwich. I'll see you later, possibly. Will I? Probably not. Anyway, maybe on a video I'll see you again. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. Bye. Thank you so much. See you later. So nice. Thank you so much. You're welcome.